whānau. So we're back here at Ngararatunua food forest that we installed exactly a year ago. So in October 2020 was when we installed this 200 square meter food forest. And now a year on, you can see it's just lush and abundant, but it's needing its next pruning. So I wanted to share with you today what steps we take in this phase of a food forest evolution. And seeing as this was in a quite frosty zone, we left it later than usual to do this intervention because we wanted enough canopy closure so that the more sensitive plants like our tamarillo and banana plants in here don't get damaged by the frost. But if you're in a frost-free zone, try and get your pruning done a little early before summer so that it has enough time to fully recover before the summer heat. In this case, we're in November now. It should still have a good month or so to fully recover before the heat sets in and can then sun damage our trees. So we've got this window in spring and autumn where we want to do our heavy pruning to allow those light wells to come into our food forest so that we can actually pulse the growth of the understory plants to come up through that light. But it has enough time to close over before summer or close over before winter, depending on if you're doing an autumn or spring prune. Okay, so a year on, the trees are just smashing forward, and what we've done first step is to actually make sure you get the understory cut first. So that's where most of your sort of weeds will show up, or your supporting biomass plants that you would have planted like cocksfoot or plantain or chicory. All those things we actually cut back with a sickle first so that you can actually assess and see your area. You can see where your fruit trees are, where your trees are. And that's why we do recommend that when you do your planting, that you do everything in a row, because the phases of intervention as your food forest grows up is so important to have them in rows, because you're there working with a sickle or a machete and you're navigating all the different plants. It's nice to have one area that you know reliably is where the plants are going to be, so you're not accidentally sickling down any valuable trees. So stage one, sickle back that undergrowth so you can assess the situation, and then you have a look at the dynamics that's going on. You identify the trees that are your emergent canopy, so the ones that you want to have on the top story of your food forest, and the ones that need more protection, like your potential fruit trees here, like the tamarillo, and ones that have been dormant underneath the growth of the canopy layer and need an extra bit of light to actually boost them upwards. You might see plants like our rose apple trees here that have actually stayed the same size all throughout winter, not because they're slow growing as such, but because they've actually been dormant with that much shade and they need that light well to open up. So you want to take into account all those different dynamics and then work accordingly with how you prune the different trees. So I'll take you through this section here. We've got a eucalyptus tree, which is our emergent canopy tree here. We've got hangi, which is a New Zealand native, like sort of a semi-shade biomass tree. Then we've got our rose apple nicely nestled down in there. That's a fruit crop. We've got our tamarillo that should be starting to fruit soon within the next few months. It's just flowering now. We've got our young guava and our cherry moyas down below that need that extra light at the moment. We've got our takoka, our cabbage tree, another native that's our emergent. It can also be a food source or for the birds. We've got our tittonia here, which is our beloved biomass plant that is just boosting right now. We've got our raisin tree nicely tucked in there, securely nurtured by the tittonia, but now needs more light to reach up and be that emergent canopy layer. And here we go again, we've got our eucalypts, and the pattern repeats itself on and on. So in this section here, I want to make sure that we crown lift the emergent canopy up so that they can occupy that emergent canopy without crowding the lower layers. That will give enough light for the lower canopy to grow up into the higher stratas. So the different tools that I like to use for the job is the sickle for our sort of ground layer, like I mentioned before. That's really handy for nifty sort of fine work, especially with grasses, oats, anything like that. Then we've got our secateurs, so again for nice sharp pruning, more delicate, and our little hand saw as well for those bigger branches that we don't want to hack through with our machete. And yeah, so lastly the machete, which is quite hard sometimes to get the technique to cut the branch in a way that it doesn't splinter. So it's probably more beneficial for you to start off with to actually use a handsaw. It's a lot slower, but it just ensures that you're giving the trees a good sharp prune and you're not having any fraying going on, especially in weather like today. As you can probably see, it's raining. You want to be cautious that any openings that you have of the branch to the environment is going to invite spores and different funguses to actually colonize it. So you want to give the plant as clean a cut as you can so it can heal much faster and much more, much faster. So in the case of this eucalyptus here, I would opt for the secateurs as the branches are quite small. And so crown lifting means that we're taking the lower limbs off, basically. Maybe for this one, come in a bit. So lifting it right up. And here you can see that we have two side branches going on there, which means that we're just creating this split. And as it grows up, that's going to become more and more extreme to the point where it's going to be really prone to wind coming along and actually pushing one apart and ripping down the whole trunk of the tree. So before I carry on limbing up this, I actually can assess, do we even want this branch at all? Is it a bit of a liability in this wind, as you can already see? So that's where you pull out your saw, do an undercut first so it doesn't split further down the trunk, and then cut from the top. There you go. Now it can put all its energy into this one trunk, ensuring that this gets really strong. As you can see, we've lifted up the crown. Now it's only occupying that top layer up there, giving enough light now for this rose apple to bounce up in growth, and this hangi to fill out that lower strata here. Then that's where a machete can come in handy, is to fully finish off the prunings of this on the ground, because if we were to lay this straight on the ground like this, that's a lot of air gaps that are visible here, meaning that it's going to dry out rather than actually decompose. So any mulch that we lay down in our food forest, we actually want to lay down as flat as possible so that there's not any room for that aeration to dry out the mulch, but it actually can decompose and fully get colonized by funguses. So that's where the machete comes in handy, to shave off those branches. And then always laying the carbon heavy stuff on the bottom, and the more nitrogen rich softer stuff on the top. That ensures that the carbon, the woodier material, is left moist and actually can decompose again as well, rather than being left on the open where it's just going to dry out as it doesn't have that soil contact. And then you can sort of pat it down, the machete, making sure it's all nice and snug, firmly cushioning that ground, protecting the soil. Then here we've got our tamarillo tree. We could give it a hard prune. It does look a little bit sickly. You can see it's been eaten at a little bit, but its fresh leaves look quite nice and vital, so I would leave it, but rather take off all the leaves that aren't serving it anymore, all these yellowing leaves, these half-bitten leaves. This just gives it a little bit of a shake up. So that's how we would just manage that and just let it grow and look forward to the fruits in a few months. Next up we have our tikoko down here. This one we don't do anything to at this stage. We let it grow up into a full tree and then we can lop off the top, pollarding, and then it'll actually form more side shoots, which means that we have more side shoots to possibly process and eat as well. So then we want to be wary of our raisin tree here, quite delicate, whilst we now deal with this tittonia. So the tittonia has been occupying this mid layer for this whole season. Now we want to give it a good reset again to allow that light to these lower stratas, the cherimoys and the guavas that are underneath it, and to open up a nice light well for this raisin tree to bounce up as high as the ukes around here. So the tools I'd use for that are your machete. It's a lot softer wood than your eucalypt and your hardwoods, so it's less likely to splinter. But if, as we get down to the lower base, if it does start to splinter for you, then again use your saw. We want to treat all our plants as nicely as possible and make sure they heal properly. Again, laying these down on contour of your bed, as flat as you can. You can see just how much biomass these plants produce. It's just amazing. For the lower branches, because I don't want to hack away into our ukes or our raisin trees here, and I also want to get some nice clean planting material, so I'll just cut them lower down with the saw. So always trying to cut just above a node so you don't have too much of an opening for any to invite any funguses. So here you got a node, might even cut up a bit higher here. Here you got a node. Yep. So I've opted for a sort of knee-high, yeah, about a foot high off the ground. That's going to quickly come bouncing up in summer, so I'm not worried about it filling out that space and reaching an emergent canopy again or having enough light. It's going to do that in no time, but it just means it gives this raisin tree a real chance to shoot up before all this regrowth closes over again. So you really want to set it back quite far, especially if you've got emergent trees that you want to occupy that space instead. So again, we've got a eucalypt here, so crown lifting, taking these lower branches off so it can put all its energy into closing up that canopy. Here you can see we've got another fork, so again we can choose which one we want so that we don't have any future splitting, but it can put all its energy up into one direction. Go. With these thicker stems, it's always wise holding on the end and pointing it away from you, maybe something on the ground if it's a thicker piece, and cutting downwards rather than up into the plant, because you'll sort of get stuck in these armpits. So here we've got our euc that we've just trimmed up. Another pioneer plant that we've got here is our brush wattles, and the reason why we've chosen both is that they have different life cycles, and that's part of the pattern assessment as well, is that in each pattern succession you want to make sure that you're occupying the right strata over time. And how we assess that is by identifying which strata each plant belongs to and having our spaces according to that, as well as the lifespan of each plant. So our euc is our biomass provider for this space. We also want pioneers that produce for a shorter period of time, or also have, what am I talking about? Okay. Another plant I want to talk about is the brush wattle here. We've put it throughout our system as a short-lived perennial to boost the system with a nitrogen fixing plant. So it's fast growing, produces a super amount of foliage, and it has really deep, strong taproots into the ground, aerating that soil around our more valuable plants. And it also draws nitrogen from the atmosphere, so it's actually increasing the amount of nitrogen that's available in the soil rather than just what's existing in the soil. It occupies the same strata as our eucalypt, but doesn't live for as long. So they're not actually going to compete with one another, because our eucalypt is going to be here for the long haul, and our brush wattle is here just to further pump the system in that crucial first few years. And the differences between them in management is that the brush wattle, even though it produces a lot more foliage and is faster growing, it's a little bit more delicate in pruning. And that sort of goes for a lot of our acacia species, is that you can't actually prune more than 30% of the tree before it suffers and dies. So unlike our euc or our alders and a lot of our other pioneer plants, where you can actually pollard them, cut them completely off at the stump or higher up, and they'll fully regrow, if you do that to our brush wattles, they will suffer and die. So that is another consideration to have when you're picking out which plants you want to use, to really understand what kind of pruning that they like or need. And in the case of our brush wattle, we want to lift up the crown but not take more than 30% of its foliage away. We want to stick it to as close as we can to that trunk, so again we're not inviting too many unnecessary diseases. So that's probably about 30% of its foliage left on. So that just gives it enough foliage up there so it's still alive, but it leaves that light coming through for our lower layer. Like for example here we've got a mulberry that actually likes being more medium high, and right now it's occupying a low layer, so quite dense shade it had before. Now it actually can fill out that medium strata where it likes to be, and we can actually have a plant that's not stressed out by light or lack of light. So yeah, so basically I'll be doing that the whole way along, assessing each plant individually, what it needs in that situation, what it needs as a whole, what it prefers as a species, and what neighbouring plants does it have around it, and considering how we prune regarding that as well. So yeah, there's a lot of considerations in this process, and it can seem a bit daunting at first, but keep at it. The best way to learn is just observe and interact as much as you can, and you start getting an eye for it, you start getting a feel for it, and within no time it all becomes second nature. So yeah, as daunting as maybe it seems what I've just said, get in there and give it a go, and yeah, before long you'll be a syntropic machete wielding warrior like all of us. So yeah, hope this video inspires you. There's probably going to be a time lapse attached to this to show you how we blitz the whole place, but yeah, here's some inspiration, get amongst it, and see you next week. Mwah, ka kite.